Green. Welcome to my philosophy channel. Green. This video may feel long, but if you stay until the end, you may begin to understand the true nature of reality, freedom, and the invisible illusions that bind human consciousness. Green. The concrete forest and the cosmic mind. Green. We live in an era of unprecedented material abundance, yet our inner lives feel increasingly confined and hopelessly fragile. Green. We have replaced the boundless wonders of the natural world with towering forests of steel and concrete. We wander through endless digital mazes, green, desperately seeking a sense of absolute certainty in a universe defined by chaotic unpredictability. Why do we feel so profoundly trapped within our own invented systems? Over 2,000 years ago, during the brutal and chaotic era of the Warring States, a philosopher named Zhuangzi observed this exact human tragedy. Green. The world around him was tearing itself apart through relentless political ambition and endless bloodshed. Yet, while kings fought desperately for fleeting mortal power, green, Zhuangzi turned his gaze upward toward the infinite cosmos. He chose to cultivate a mind vast enough to swallow the entire universe. Green. He existed in a state of absolute poverty, wearing patched clothes and tying his shoes with broken hemp. However, his internal world was immeasurably rich, green, overflowing with a profound mystical awareness that transcended all earthly limitations. He recognized that human beings constantly imprison themselves through their terrifying addiction to social status, green, wealth, and public validation. We willingly enter cages of our own making, believing those cages represent ultimate security. Zhuangzi declared with unshakable certainty that heaven and earth and I are born together, and all things and I are one. This was not a mere poetic metaphor, but a radical declaration of cosmic unity. He understood that the illusion of separation is the root cause of all human suffering. When we desperately try to isolate our egos from the natural flow of the universe, we invite deep existential terror. Modern society functions as a relentless machine designed to amplify this illusion of separation. We are taught from birth to compete, to accumulate, and to dominate our environment. Green. We view nature as a resource to be exploited rather than a sacred harmony to be experienced. We constantly measure our tiny, finite lives against artificial milestones, green, forgetting that we are momentary expressions of an infinite and eternal process. Green. When we strip away our job titles, our bank accounts, and our carefully curated social identities, what truly remains? Zhuangzi demands that we confront the absolute emptiness of human ambition. Green. He invites us to stand completely alone in the vast wilderness of the cosmos, stripped of all artificial pretenses. Green. Only when we relinquish our desperate need for control can we finally begin to hear the silent breathing of the universe. Green. The heaviest chains we bear are the ones we proudly forge with our own desires. Green. The sacrificial ox and the trap of worldly prestige. Green. Human nature harbors a deep and insatiable hunger for recognition, power, and elevated social standing. We spend our fleeting decades climbing treacherous hierarchies, green, sacrificing our physical health and inner peace for the temporary applause of strangers. We are conditioned to believe that becoming important is the ultimate purpose of a successful human life. Green. But what is the actual, hidden cost of this desperate clinging to worldly prestige? Green. Historical records suggest that the king of Chu once heard of Zhuangzi and his peerless intellect. The powerful monarch dispatched 2 high-ranking emissaries, bearing vast amounts of gold, green, hoping to employ the philosopher as his prime minister. For any ordinary man trapped in the brutal deprivation of the ancient world, this offer would represent the ultimate validation. Green. It was a direct ticket to absolute power, comfort, and lasting historical glory. Green. The emissaries found Zhuangzi sitting quietly beside a muddy river, calmly fishing with a simple bamboo pole. Without even turning his head to acknowledge their magnificent royal garments, green, he asked them. A deeply piercing question. He inquired about a sacred tortoise, shell held within the royal shrine of the kingdom. This dead tortoise had been revered for 3,000 years, wrapped in silk and honored by generations of ambitious kings. Zhuangzi calmly asked the messengers whether that sacred tortoise would have preferred to die and leave its shell to be worshipped, or if it would have preferred to remain alive, dragging its heavy tail joyfully through the dirty mud. The emissaries, caught in the flawless logic of the philosopher, admitted that the tortoise would have undoubtedly chosen to live and drag its tail in the mud. With a slight, knowing smile, Zhuangzi dismissed the royal messengers, telling them to go away so that he might continue dragging his own tail in the mud. He completely rejected the position of prime minister, understanding that political power demands the absolute surrender of personal freedom. He equated the highest office in the land to becoming a beautifully decorated sacrificial ox, fattened solely for the inevitable day of its violent slaughter. We must apply this radical perspective to our modern obsession with career advancement and corporate domination. We willingly dress ourselves in expensive suits, marching proudly into high-glass towers that function as modern altars of sacrifice. We trade our most precious commodity, our irreplaceable time, for empty titles and digits on a screen. We become beautifully decorated sacrificial animals, utterly blind to the slow mutilation of our authentic spiritual selves. True nobility is found not in ruling others, but in maintaining the absolute sovereignty of one's own soul. Chapter 3. The Autumn Floods and the Relativity of Perspective. The human mind is naturally prone to a dangerous cognitive bias known as the self-centered perspective. We desperately cling to our tiny fragment of experiential knowledge, arrogantly assuming it represents the absolute totality of universal truth. We mistake the small fenced yard of our personal understanding for the boundless landscape of reality. This epistemological arrogance blindly prevents us from grasping the true immensity of the surrounding cosmos. Zhuangzi illustrated this psychological tragedy through the magnificent allegory of the autumn floods. He described the proud god of the Yellow River, watching the heavy autumn rains swell his mighty waters. The river expanded until the opposite shores disappeared from view. Overwhelmed by his own colossal scale, the river god became intoxicated with supreme arrogance, believing that all the majestic beauty of the world was contained exclusively within his rushing currents. Driven by his immense pride, the river god journeyed eastward, flowing down toward the vast and uncharted ocean. When he finally reached the coast and gazed out at the endless expanse of the northern sea, his arrogant heart instantly shattered. He stared into the boundless, unfathomable depths that stretched far beyond the horizon. In that humbling moment, he realized the absolute insignificance of his own trivial existence. The spirit of the northern sea gently rebuked the humiliated river god, explaining the fundamental relativity of all perspective. You cannot discuss the ocean with a tiny frog trapped at the bottom of a deep well, because the frog is limited by his confined space. You cannot discuss the freezing winter ice with a fragile insect born in the summer, because the insect is bound entirely by its short temporal span. Similarly, you cannot discuss the infinite Tao with a narrow-minded scholar who is tightly bound by rigid ideological dogma. We are all like the frog in the well, looking up at a tiny circle of light and believing we see the entire sky. We judge the universe using pathetically inadequate instruments, measuring cosmic truths with the tiny rulers of human logic, economics, and social convention. When we honestly confront the infinite scale of space and the unending flow of time, our petty, earthly anxieties dissolve into nothingness. Our desperate grasping for certainty is revealed as a childish illusion. Acknowledging our own profound ignorance is not a defeat, but a glorious emancipation. It is the essential first step toward aligning our finite human consciousness with the infinite rhythms of the natural world. Wisdom begins only when the illusion of absolute certainty collapses under the weight of the infinite. Chapter 4. The Bridge of How and the Limits of Language. We heavily rely upon the fragile architecture of human language to construct our daily perception of reality. We believe that by naming a thing, categorizing a feeling, or articulating a concept, we have somehow mastered it. Yet language is fundamentally an artifice, a clumsy tool that violently chops the seamless flow of the universe into isolated, digestible fragments. Words can point toward the truth, but they can never contain the truth itself. Zhuangzi brilliantly demonstrated the severe limitations of logical discourse during a famous encounter with his rival, the logician Huizi. The two philosophers were strolling peacefully across the beautiful bridge of the How River. Zhuangzi looked down at the water and poetically remarked that the tiny minnows were darting about freely, declaring that this was the true happiness of the fish. Huizi, a master of analytical rationality, immediately seized the opportunity to challenge Zhuangzi's joyful assertion. He demanded strict empirical proof, asking how Zhuangzi, not being a fish, could possibly possess objective knowledge of the fish's internal emotional state. Huizi's mind was trapped within the rigid boundaries of subject and object, believing that genuine understanding requires absolute division and measurable evidence. Zhuangzi responded with a masterful stroke of dialectical genius. He calmly asked Huizi how he, not being Zhuangzi, could possibly know that Zhuangzi did not know the happiness of the fish. Huizi confidently replied that because he was not Zhuangzi, he indeed did not know Zhuangzi's mind, which therefore proved Zhuangzi could not know the mind of the fish. The trap of logic appeared utterly inescapable. However, Zhuangzi refused to play by the artificial rules of formal logic. He gently reminded Huizi to return to the original root of the question. When Huizi asked how Zhuangzi knew the fish were happy, he already acknowledged that Zhuangzi knew it. Zhuangzi simply stated that he knew it by standing above the rushing water of the How River. He knew it not through empirical measurement, but through direct, intuitive communion with nature. This profound interaction reveals the tragic flaw of our modern analytical worldview. We endlessly dissect the mechanics of the universe, while completely missing the poetry of its existence. We demand hard data, peer-reviewed studies, and statistical proof before we allow ourselves to believe in the magic of being alive. Zhuangzi urges us to discard the restrictive net of language once we have successfully grasped the silent meaning of the river. The deepest truths of the universe cannot be argued. They can only be silently experienced. Chapter 5. The Halter on the Horse and the Prison of Artificial Morality. Human civilization is built upon a massive foundation of artificial rules, ethical codes, and complex moral judgments. We create elaborate systems of righteousness and benevolence, endlessly evaluating one another based on conformity to cultural expectations. We call this process civilization, education, and moral progress. But Zhuangzi saw these norms not as achievements, but as invisible instruments of cruel psychological oppression. He argued radically that the institutionalization of morality actually destroys the innate, spontaneous goodness of the human soul. When we attempt to force nature into rigid ideological boxes, we inevitably cause profound suffering. A wild horse naturally possesses hooves strong enough to tread on frost and snow, and hair thick enough to withstand the bitter winter wind. It eats grass, drinks water, and gallops freely across the boundless plains. Then the arrogant human trainer arrives, falsely claiming that he knows how to properly manage horses. He brands them, clips their hair, trims their hooves, and binds them tightly with heavy ropes and halters. He forces them into cramped stables, breaking their wild spirits through systematic discipline. By the time the trainer is finished shaping the horse to human standards, More than half of the magnificent animals have died from the abuse. Zhuangzi applied this devastating critique directly to the highly revered Confucian philosophers of his day. He believed that by endlessly preaching rigid rules of righteousness, duty, and filial piety, society was effectively forcing a halter onto the human soul. We take beautifully wild, unpredictable human beings and methodically mutilate their innate nature to fit neatly into the functioning machinery of the social order. In our modern digital era, this invisible mutilation has only become more sophisticated and pervasive. We are relentlessly groomed by algorithmic surveillance, cultural shaming, and performative morality. We constantly curate fake digital avatars, desperately attempting to project perfect righteousness and utopian happiness. We extinguish our spontaneous desires, terrified of deviating even slightly from the aggressively policed boundaries of acceptable social behavior. Zhuangzi teaches us that true virtue does not require a rulebook, just as a bird does not need instructions to sing. When we aggressively enforce artificial goodness, we eradicate genuine compassion. The path to ultimate freedom requires us to bravely burn the scripts we have been handed, refusing to let the architects of society carve up our original, unblemished spiritual nature for their own utilitarian purposes. A bird in a golden cage is still a prisoner denied the vastness of the sky. Chapter 6. The Singing Widower and the Endless Rhythm of Transformation. There is no fear more universal, more deeply ingrained within the human psyche than the trembling fear of death. We spend astonishing amounts of medical resources, emotional energy, and philosophical desperation attempting to postpone the inevitable erasure of our consciousness. We view death as the ultimate tragedy, an unfair annihilation that violently snatches away everything we have earned, loved, and carefully built over our lifetimes. Zhuangzi confronted the concept of mortality with a revolutionary paradigm of unwavering acceptance and joyous surrender. He did not see life and death as two terrifyingly opposed forces, but rather as a singular, continuous process of beautiful cosmic transformation. To him, complaining about death was as foolish as a child throwing a violent tantrum, because the warm spring must inevitably give way to the crisp autumn. When Zhuangzi's beloved wife passed away, his dear friend Huizi came to offer conventional condolences. Huizi was shocked and appalled to find Zhuangzi sitting casually on the ground, with his legs splayed out, beating joyfully on a wooden basin and singing a cheerful song. To the rigid, morally conditioned mind of his friend, this bizarre behavior was not only inappropriate, but deeply offensive to the sacred memory of the deceased. Zhuangzi calmly explained the profound psychological journey that guided him from grief to absolute inner peace. When his wife first died, he felt the same crushing sorrow as any normal human being. But then he looked deeply into the origins of her existence. He realized that before her birth, she had no shape, no form, and no vital energy. She was merely a formless potential resting within the vast intermingling of cosmic chaos. Through a miraculous transformation, the formless chaos gathered energy, the energy solidified into physical form, and the form breathed the beautiful breath of life. Now, through another entirely natural transformation, she had simply passed from the realm of the living back into the quiet chamber of eternal rest. To weep bitterly over her passing would be to arrogantly protest the supreme, immutable law of the great universe itself. In another striking allegory, Zhuangzi used a sun-bleached skull as a pillow. In a dream, the skull spoke to him, revealing that the dead are finally free from the crushing anxieties of ambitious monarchs, cruel landlords, and the biting cold of winter. Death is simply the peaceful dissolution of the burden of identity. When we finally stop clinging to our fragile forms, we realize we have always been indestructible waves moving across an eternal ocean. To fear the end of the song is to miss the magnificent beauty of the music while it plays. Chapter 7. The Butterfly Paradox and the Collapse of the Absolute Subject. The most tenacious illusion governing human life is the rigid attachment to the concept of the individual self. We build massive fortresses of ego, desperately defending our personal opinions, our accumulated memories, and our chosen identities against the constant friction of the world. We believe without hesitation that our waking reality is the singular, objective truth, and that we are the unquestioned masters of our own conscious experience. Zhuangzi completely obliterated this stubborn illusion with what remains the most famous and elegantly unsettling dream in all of philosophical history. He dreamed with absolute clarity that he was a radiant butterfly, fluttering joyously through the warm air, moving from flower to flower. In that transcendent state, he knew only the spontaneous delight of perfect freedom. He had completely forgotten that he was ever a heavy, burdened human being named Zhuangzi. Suddenly, and without warning, the dream dissolved. He awoke to find himself lying heavy on his bed, trapped once again in the dense, physical flesh of a mortal man. But instead of brushing the dream aside as a meaningless phantasm, Zhuangzi was struck by a profound and disorienting realization. The boundary between reality and illusion had completely collapsed, leaving his concept of identity permanently shattered. He pondered the ultimate epistemological paradox. Was he a human being who had just dreamed of being a carefree butterfly? Or was he, in fact, a sleeping butterfly who was currently dreaming that he was a burdened human being named Zhuangzi? Both realities felt equally absolute while they were being experienced. How could he possibly prove which state was the authentic anchor of his true existence? This powerful parable is not merely a clever word game. It is a devastating assault on the human addiction to control and certainty. It demonstrates the infinite relativity of perspective and the illusion of a permanent, unchanging self. If our solid reality can dissolve instantly upon waking, then perhaps the things we agonize over in our daily lives, our debts, our reputations, our fears are nothing more than the fleeting phantoms of a heavy human dream. We must learn to embody the transformation of things, floating smoothly between roles and identities without ever becoming brutally attached to any single one. When we finally release the desperate grip on our fabricated personas, we discover an astonishing lightness of being. We realize that the universe is continuously dreaming us into existence, and that we are free to simply enjoy the unfolding narrative without terrifying ourselves with the need to control it. The man who realizes he is dreaming no longer trembles when the nightmare approaches. Chapter 8. The Gnarled Tree and the Supreme Power of Absolute Uselessness. Our capitalist framework categorizes every available element of the world, including human life, into strict binaries of value. We endlessly sort everything. We encounter into piles of the useful and the useless. We monetize our passions, optimize our leisure time, and ruthlessly quantify our personal growth. We are terrified of being deemed useless by society, because utility has become the singular metric by which we justify our very right to exist. Zhuangzi flipped this utilitarian madness upside down by introducing the revolutionary concept of the uselessness as true use. He told the story of a massive, ancient tree that stood proudly by a bustling dirt road. Its trunk was grotesquely knotted, its branches terribly twisted, and its wood so spongy that it defied the chalk line and the axe. It was a complete and utter failure, according to the strict standards of industrial measurement. A passing master carpenter looked at the great tree with absolute disdain. He boldly declared to his apprentices that the tree was entirely worthless. If you made a boat from it, the boat would quickly sink. If you made a coffin from it, the coffin would immediately rot. If you made a door from it, sap would bleed endlessly. Because it lacked all practical utility, the carpenter walked past it without a second glance. Zhuangzi quietly pointed out the exquisite irony resting beneath the carpenter's arrogant disdain. Precisely because the twisted tree exhibited absolutely no useful qualities to desperate, calculating men, it managed to survive for centuries. The straight, beautiful pine trees were immediately chopped down by greedy loggers. The fruit-bearing trees were violently beaten with sticks and stripped of their branches. Their exceptional usefulness directly brought about their violent, premature annihilation. The massive gnarled tree, having freed itself from the tyranny of human purpose, earned the ultimate gift of free and unbothered existence. It grew vast enough to provide restful shade for thousands of exhausted travelers. Zhuangzi advises us to plant ourselves in the vast field of boundless emptiness, wandering effortlessly beneath our own shadow. He begs us to stop mutilating our souls in a desperate attempt to become useful tools for a machine that will eventually discard us. True freedom in this chaotic world ultimately means living a life entirely devoid of external purpose. It is escaping the anxious orbit of productivity and reclaiming the sacred right to exist simply for the sake of existing. We must cultivate the courage to become utterly useless to the oppressive demands of artificial hierarchies, and in doing so, reclaim the sovereign territory of our own indestructible peace. Only when you become utterly useless to the demands of the world do you finally become completely yours. If this deep exploration into the mystical wisdom of Zhuangzi has sparked a shift in your conscious perspective, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. Your support allows us to continue unraveling the most profound philosophical mysteries of human existence. As you step back out into the rushing tides of your own busy reality, I want to leave you with one deep, unsettling question to ponder in the silence of your own mind. If the heavy life you are clinging to right now is nothing but a dream within a dream, what is keeping you from simply opening your wings and flying?